In the world we live in, there are countless stories that seem to only appear in movies, thrilling, touching, even too unreal to be true. But do you know? In fact, those stories have been happening, silently, fiercely, and very real, right in the middle of this society. Today, I will tell you a true story in the United States. A story that I am sure, when you hear it, you will have to sit still for a few seconds. Now, sit down, relax, and listen with me. And I am sure that this story will teach you many things from this story. The Hargrove Mansion was nestled north of the city, where stone walls were covered with dark green vines, and the black tiled roof gleamed in the early morning sunlight. In the kitchen, the clatter of pans and the smell of baking bread wafted through the air like a familiar morning routine. Here are your eggs. As usual, poached, toasted on both sides. Charles Hargrove set the plate in front of Emily. Smiling serenely, Emily raised her eyebrows, her long hair falling in soft curls over her shoulders as she tilted her head to look at him. You know I've been eating poached since I was 8, right? Well, I'm still 8 in your eyes. He shrugged, quietly pouring himself coffee. She laughed, but there was something else in her eyes, as if something was going on in her head that he couldn't see. Emily was 18, having just graduated from high school at the top of her class. She was about to apply to college, but she hadn't decided on a major yet. Despite the luxury and love she had, she still carried with her a sense of loss, a nameless feeling, born of the dim memories of her childhood and the voids her grandfather had never truly filled. "Grandpa," Emily said slowly as she sliced the bread, "do you ever think about my mother?" Charles's fork paused in midair. He set it down slowly. "Every day," he replied softly, his voice as low as a leaf falling to the ground. "I don't remember anything, not her face, not her voice, just the sea breeze and the salt in my hair." He looked out the window, where the sunlight sparkled on the small pond in the garden. My mother, used to say that the sea was the only place she felt free. Like me." Emily smiled sadly. A moment of silence passed. "You know," he said, his voice soft as if he were telling a fairy tale. He always wanted to live somewhere with waves all year round. A little house by the sea. Just big enough for the family and a shaggy dog. "So why are we living here surrounded by rocks and glass?" Emily asked, her eyes scanning the large painting in the dining room, a portrait of him as a young man. His face cold and confident. "Because I made so many wrong choices." Charles took a sip of coffee, his smile fading. "But I kept a promise, to raise you to be strong. To be able to choose the life you want." Emily looked at him for a long time. "And if one day you choose to leave?" "It will hurt me, but I will let you go," he replied, without hesitation. The morning passed slowly as usual. But for Emily, it left a strange aftertaste. Her grandfather's words about mistakes and choices made her think. Since she was little, she had never heard him mention the past with such sadness. And for the first time, he did not try to change the subject as usual. That afternoon, while Mr. Charles was out for a board meeting, Emily quietly entered his office, the forbidden place in the house. The room was tidy. The smell of old oak and men's cologne mixed like the smell of closed memories. On the desk, documents were stacked neatly. On the wall were awards. Pictures of him when he was an icon of Manhattan finance. But what caught Emily's attention was the small safe behind the painting. She hesitated, but then, as if a voice was urging her from within, she walked over. Pulled the painting aside. The code? She tried her own birth date. It didn't open. Then she tried her mother's birth date, something she'd seen on her birth certificate last year. Beep. Click. The door opened. Inside were a few files, a box of old photos, and a stack of faded newspapers. Emily's heart was pounding. She pulled out the first newspaper. The headline caught her eye. Cruise boat explodes off Florida coast. Hargrove family in tragedy. The accompanying photo showed the burning ship. And in the article, her parents' names were clearly visible. She flipped to the next page, corporate filings. Financial news. Headlines filled with words like, takeover. Ruthless competition. Hargrove beats Kessler Dynamics. Emily sank to the floor. Her hands shaking. She couldn't put it all together. But one thing was clear. Her grandfather had been hiding something from her, something important. That evening, when Mr. Charles returned, he found her sitting in his study, holding the old newspaper. Her eyes no longer the smiling granddaughter they had always been. "I came in." He paused in the doorway. "Yes, I think I have a right to know." Emily did not shout, but her voice was cold. Charles stepped in, closing the door behind him. The room suddenly shrank between the two generations facing each other. It was a dark chapter in the past. He began, his old eyes boring into the young girl's. "And I tried to bury it, so you wouldn't grow up hating it. But those were your parents. They're dead, and what about me? I'm sitting here, on this pile of glory, as if nothing had happened." "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "If I could give anything to bring them back, I would. I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping you away from that truth." There was a long, heavy silence. Emily stood up. "I need time." "Emily," he called softly. The house was unusually quiet for 3 days after that night. Charles tried to keep things as normal as possible. He still made breakfast. He still read the paper every morning as if nothing had happened. But the seat across the table was always empty. Emily locked herself in her room. There was no music, no phone calls, no keyboard tapping that Charles often heard down in the study. She was silent, as if she were pulling layers of faith from her chest. On the 4th day, she walked out of the room. Her face was thinner, her hair tied back, her suitcase ready. Charles stood up when he saw her at the top of the stairs. "Where are you going?" he asked. His voice calm but his eyes panicked. "I don't know yet," she replied, not looking directly at him. "But I can't live here anymore." "Emily, I'm sorry. I know I can't undo what happened. But you're all I have left." "Have you ever thought about what my mother said to you?" she asked. Looking at him for the first time in a long time. The words were like a slap in the face to the memory. Emily took a deep breath. "I need to leave, not because I hate you, but because I need to understand who I am without living in the shadow of the past you created." He was silent. His hand shook as he handed her the envelope containing the money and bank card. "At least take this." She took it, without thanking him. The door closed behind her. And Charles stood frozen in the doorway, the young girl's figure disappearing behind the red maple trees. Disappearing from the world he had held so tightly for 18 years. Emily took the overnight train to the West Coast, no destination in sight. Only that she needed to leave this place of fake paint and ghosts. After a day and a half, she ended up in a small coastal town in Oregon. No one here knew Hargrove, and no one cared who she was. She rented a small room behind an old coffee shop. The walls were peeling, the bed creaked, but at least it was hers. At night, she stood on the beach, the waves lapping at her feet. Cold, Emily turned on her phone, saw dozens of missed calls from her grandfather. Short messages. "Are you okay? Please text me back." She turned off the screen, stuffed it into her windbreaker pocket. Next to her, a local boy, in his early 20s, kicking a pebble in the sand, smiled. "Newbie?" She nodded. "Don't worry, everyone here was once a newcomer," he said, and walked away, leaving a gentle but deeply engraved sentence in Emily's mind. Sometimes it takes getting lost to find where you belong. The following days passed in a somewhat false calm. Emily took a temporary job as a waitress at a small cafe by the sea. In exchange for a few hot meals and some pocket money, she learned to live without a maid, without a driver, without her grandfather. But what she couldn't escape was the feeling of being watched. At first, it was just a hunch, a glance through the glass door. The sound of strange footsteps behind her as it got dark. She ignored it, thinking she was worrying too much, until she caught sight of a strange man standing across from the cafe. Not buying anything, not going anywhere, just watching. His eyes met hers for a moment that sent a chill down her spine. That night, when Emily returned to her room, she realized the window was no longer locked as she remembered. She immediately called her grandfather, but her finger paused on the call button. She was afraid that if she picked up the phone, he would drag her back, lock her in a luxurious glass cage again. She chose silence. Meanwhile, in New York, Charles Hargrove was no longer a proud figure. He was visibly aging. Every meeting was interrupted by an unanswered call. Every night began with the light in his niece's room still on in his memory. He hired a private investigator to monitor his bank card transactions. When he learned that Emily was in Oregon, he immediately sent someone to the area to provide covert protection, but it was too late. In a darkened room, 3 men sat around a computer screen that showed Emily working in a coffee shop. The sole heir to the Hargrove family, a deep voice said, his fingers tapping on the table. And this time, he has no corporation or money to protect him. The man in the middle, a man with silver hair and a scarred face, was Richard Kessler. Despite losing everything, his hatred kept him alive for decades. Let's wait a few more days. When she's no longer on guard. Richard paused, his eyes blazing. We'll take away the only thing he has left. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat on the bed, holding her mother's diary, the one she carried with her like a treasure. The last page contained a single line written in smudged ink. No matter what happens, your daughter must live, and be loved properly. Emily clutched the notebook, her eyes stinging. She didn't know if she was doing the right thing, but at least she had dared to step out of the shadow of the past. A soft noise came from the window. She turned, the curtains were swaying in the wind, but there was no one there. The next afternoon, a girl walked into the cafe, about 20, athletic, with a canvas backpack and sunglasses. Looking like a backpacker, she sat down at the table Emily was clearing. Iced latte, little milk, no sugar, and a little advice. She smiled, revealing a small silver stud on her lower lip. You're new here, right? Emily smiled politely. That's obvious? Yeah, the locals don't look at the ocean like they want to talk to it. The girl held out her hand. I'm Zoe. Used to be like you. Zoe spoke easily, with a little humor, a little wild freedom that Emily secretly admired. They talked for an hour, about leaving the city for the countryside. About finding herself, about not knowing where she belonged. Zoe didn't ask much about Emily, and that made Emily open up more easily. At the end of the meeting, Zoe said, we have a small group, a sort of escape the world group. There's a bonfire on the south tip tonight. Come if you want. It's safe. There's music, cookies, and no one asks about the past. Emily hesitated, then nodded. Maybe I need a night like that. 8:30 p.m. The tip was 2 miles from town. Zoe picked Emily up in an old pickup truck. There were 2 other young men in the car, both quiet. But Zoe kept the atmosphere light with small jokes. As they turned onto the coastal path, the headlights shone through the sparse pine forest, creating flickering streaks of light as if entering another world. After about 15 minutes, the car stopped in the middle of a clearing. No bonfire, no cookies, just cold wind and the sound of the waves. Emily turned around. We're here? Zoe hung up. The smile was gone. One of the men got out and opened Emily's door. Get out, he said. Emily jumped. What? Zoe said coldly. We're not having a party. Emily. She backed away, her heart pounding. Who are you? A black duffel bag was pulled over her head before she could scream. New York. At the same time, Charles was standing at the unfinished chessboard in the living room, a knight in his hand. He'd been playing alone lately, partly to keep his mind clear, partly to distract himself from his absence. The phone rang. The name on the screen read, Foster, Personal Security. Something's up, sir. The voice on the other end didn't beat around the bush. We lost Emily in Oregon town at 8:35 p.m. The phone's GPS was off. The cafe's cameras showed her leaving with a group of strangers. We're pulling the license plate number. Charles put the piece down. His hand shook. Deploy all forces. Use all resources. Level 1 alert. And Foster. Yes? Don't let anyone touch that child. At any cost. Emily woke in the dark. The smell of mold and old wood filled her nostrils. She lay on the cold wooden floor, her hands tied behind her back with rough rope. Her head ached, her mouth dry. She tried to open her eyes. Tried to remember, Zoe. The car, the guy, the bag over her head. It all came back like a twisted nightmare. A figure opened the door. The blinding light made her blink repeatedly. A man walked in. His face was scarred, his gaze sharp, His hair was gray, but his posture was as steady as a rock. He pulled up a wooden chair across from Emily, sitting down as if he were in his own living room. "You're the spitting image of your mother," he said, his voice hoarse. "The hair, the eyes, the way you looked at people. Like he could see right through their skin." Emily glared. "Who are you?" Richard Kessler. The name made her freeze. The pages of the newspaper. The name her grandfather always avoided. The one who had disappeared from the business world after the power struggle 18 years ago. "You should know," he continued. "Your parents' deaths were the result of your grandfather's cruelty. He took everything from me, the company, the reputation, the family. My wife committed suicide. My son ran away without a trace." Emily tried to keep her voice calm. "And now you think kidnapping me will make you feel better?" "No," Richard chuckled. "It will make Charles Hargrove feel the full extent of his loss, this time. Without bribery. Without concealment." Hargrove Corp. Headquarters, New York. A short video file was sent directly to Charles's device. In it, Emily was tied up, gagged, staring at the camera with terrified eyes. Behind her was Richard Kessler, his expression cold as ice. "I took justice into my own hands," Richard said in the video. "If you want to see her alive, take whatever you have left to the location listed in the attached file. Alone, no police, no bodyguards. If I smell the FBI, she's gone forever." Charles gripped the arms of his chair. The veins on his wrists stood out. His face was pale, but his voice did not shake. "Get the private jet ready. We're going to Oregon." 3 days later, an abandoned industrial park on the outskirts of a coastal town. The old Bentley rolled into the junkyard. Between rows of rusty shipping containers, Charles sat in the back, wearing an old gray suit, holding a black leather briefcase, all the Hargrove Corporation's ownership papers, personal accounts, access codes. Richard was waiting. Beside him were 2 of his men, and Emily, tired, but alive. Charles stepped out of the car, not panicking. "I came alone. No weapons, no tricks. You win, Richard." "Not yet," Richard snorted. "You only win if I kill you like you killed my family." "But no, I'll let you live in loss." Charles placed the briefcase on the rusty iron table. "Everything's here, even the withdrawal codes. Just make sure my niece is safe." There was a pause. Richard stared into Charles's eyes, and in that moment, he seemed to realize something had changed. "Hand her over," Richard ordered. Emily was pushed toward Charles, staggering but steadying herself. Charles caught her, holding her tight. I'm fine, she whispered. Richard smiled faintly, stepping forward to take the briefcase. But as he opened it, a small beep sounded. Before he could react, headlights came from 3 directions. Sirens wailed. The FBI, private agents, and local police rushed in. Charles whispered to Emily, I'm sorry, but I can't bet your life on an old man's honor. Kessler struggled, but was restrained within seconds. Emily hugged him tightly. For the first time in weeks, she cried. Not out of fear, but because she finally saw that her grandfather had truly changed. The coastal hospital still had its old architecture, off-white walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the steady beat of a heart monitor. Like the beat of life being restored. Emily lay in bed, covered in a thin blanket. She was no longer tied up, no longer gagged, but the feeling of confinement still clung to her. From the window of her hospital room, she could see a stretch of blue-gray sea, the waves wearily crashing against the sand. Charles sat in the corner of the room, on a simple plastic chair, holding a cup of coffee that he had not had since early morning. He had been sitting there since she had been brought in. Are you awake yet? He asked, softly, as if afraid to startle her. Emily turned her head to look, her eyes still watery, but not as cold as before. Did you call the police? She asked. Charles nodded. I don't know how much he fought, but yes, he did, because he couldn't lose you, not again. She was silent for a moment, then said, when they covered my head, I thought it was over. And the only thing I saw in my mind was you, in the kitchen, baking. He bowed his head, saying nothing. His shoulders shook slightly. I don't forgive everything, Grandpa, she continued, her voice hoarse. "But I know, you really loved me. And that saved me from being afraid." Charles stood up, walked slowly to the bed. He sat down, took her hand, for the first time not as a protector, but as a broken man. "You lost everything, the company, the reputation, the money, but as long as I live, you have everything." Emily looked into his eyes, the eyes of a man who had once been a giant of finance. Now a frail old man with thin hands and an ocean of regret. She squeezed his hand. "I'm tired, Grandpa. Tired of running. Tired of hating. Tired of keeping it all inside." He nodded. "Then this time, I'll go back, and there'll be nothing left to run from." 3 days later, when the doctor declared Emily well enough to leave the hospital, Charles did as he had promised. No return to New York. No return to the mansion. No limo. No servants. They drove in a rented pickup truck, carrying a few bags and a wooden crate containing the few things Charles had managed to retrieve: Emily's mother's diary, a box of family photos, and the old coffee maker he used to make her coffee every morning. The beach house in southern Oregon, which had belonged to Emily's parents, had been largely abandoned for 18 years. It was nestled against the sand, its wooden walls faded, its shingles peeling off in patches from the ocean winds. But when they walked in, Emily felt something real touch her heart. Not that the house was beautiful, it wasn't, but it was theirs. Charles stood in the middle of the living room, looking around. "My mother used to call this the only place she felt like herself." Emily smiled. "Now I want to experience that feeling, too." The following days passed in an unfamiliar peace. Charles, who had only known how to run shareholder meetings and read the Wall Street Journal, now learned how to mop wooden floors, change light bulbs, and go to the morning market to buy fish. Every morning, he still made coffee for both of them, but this time with trembling hands and a real heart. Emily gradually found herself again. She got up early to walk on the beach, wrote in the small notebook her mother left her, and every afternoon, sat by the window reading a book with a cup of hot tea. They didn't talk much, but each gesture was gentle, like a silent apology. One afternoon, while sweeping leaves behind the porch, Charles stopped and called out to her. "Emily, I found this." He held out a small rusty tin box, the old family mailbox. Inside, there were a few old handwritten notes, a birthday card, and an unsent letter, from Emily's mother, to Mr. Charles. Emily opened the letter with trembling hands, her mother's voice coming through the soft handwriting. "Dad, I don't blame you for what's happening, but I hope you understand, we can't keep winning if we trade it for family. I hope you'll choose family over power someday. If I don't get to say this, tell my granddaughter for me, love, with all your heart." Charles read with Emily. He didn't cry, his eyes were dry from years of remorse. But when he looked at Emily, something melted, as light as salt washed away by the sea. "I think Mom forgives you," she said softly. Charles didn't answer, but he nodded, not in confirmation, but as a promise to live the rest of his life to the fullest. That morning, as the first light filtered through the curtains, Emily woke to the sound of waves, steady as the heartbeat of the earth. The smell of baked goods and coffee filled the small kitchen, and she knew Grandpa had kept to his old ways, even though the world had changed. Charles was standing in front of the old gas stove, fiddling with a nearly scratched nonstick pan. "Today's special, double-thick pancakes, which can be used as floor tiles if all else fails," he said, without turning around. Emily laughed, her first laugh since they'd been here. "You know what?" she said, pouring orange juice. "There's something very peaceful about this place. Like time has stopped. Or maybe it's starting again," Charles said, placing the plate of pancakes in front of her. They ate in silence, not for lack of things to say, but because there was no need to say anything more. Later that morning, Emily walked to the beach. She brought a thin blanket, a notebook, and a small pocket camera, the only thing she had kept from the old villa. She sat down on a large rock and wrote a few lines. The day, I don't remember clearly. The sea was still blue. The wind was still blowing. But I was different. He was no longer a symbol, he was a person. A real person. And me? I was no longer a doll of an empire. But a living girl. Finally. Truly alive. Emily raised her head, watching the sun shine through the water. Meanwhile, back home, Charles was packing a box of old books when he accidentally dropped a college invitation. It had been sent to his old address in New York, but had been forwarded. He opened it. The bold print read, "Congratulations, Emily Hargrove. Welcome to Northwestern University, Department of Journalism." He smiled, and in that moment, he knew she wouldn't be here forever, and that was okay. That evening, they sat on the porch, two wooden chairs facing the ocean. The cold wind carried the smell of salt and the distant call of seagulls. "I'm going back to school," Emily said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know," Charles replied, "but I'm not leaving you. It's just, I want to get on with the rest of my life." "I'm not leaving anyone," he said, putting his hand on her shoulder. "I'm just living, like my parents would have wanted." For a long moment, they were both silent, listening to the lullaby of the ocean. At their feet, 2 cups of hot tea steamed, and in the sky, the stars began to appear, not bright, but bright enough to guide the resurrected soul. The first month at the beach house passed like a page written in pale ink, light, quiet, and memorable. Emily gradually got used to waking up every morning without a tight schedule, without a manager, without the constraints of meetings or the bright lights of the upper class. Instead, there was the sound of waves, the sound of wind, the creaking of wood underfoot, and the sound of her grandfather coughing lightly every time he tried to make coffee with his left hand. Charles still had the same demeanor, neat from early morning, reading the newspaper on an outdated iPad, and writing by hand in a black leather notebook. But he was no longer Chairman Charles Hargrove. Now, he was Old Charles from across the hill, as the people in the small town affectionately called him. Every afternoon, the two of them walked along the beach. One day, Charles recounted the first time he ran Hargrove Corp. On his own. Another day, Emily recounted the first time she got a bad grade and didn't dare tell him. Sometimes they said nothing at all, just watched the sun set over the sea, as if the light were carrying away all the things that had never been said. And then, one day, Charles brought home an old wooden crate from the flea market. "What's this?" Emily asked, wiping her hands after washing the vegetables. "A shelf," he said. "We'll make a bookcase, a small one, by the window, where you can read, and I can sit and drink my tea." "When did you learn carpentry?" "I don't know, but an old man who's almost dead should know how to make a shelf. Right?" They worked together all afternoon, clumsily, haphazardly, but with laughter, and that night, they put the bookcase in place, a little off, but perfect, to them. One morning, as Emily was setting the table, Charles pulled out a chair and handed her a small envelope. "What's this?" "A late graduation present," he said. "I've been meaning to give it to you since I got my college letter. But it wasn't the right time." Emily opened it. Inside was a thin necklace, with a small compass pendant. Simple, delicate, and engraved below, "Always find your way home." Emily clasped the gift in her hands, silent for a moment. "Thank you," she said, and for the first time since they'd arrived, she stepped forward to hug him. Not out of pity, not out of emotion, because she had truly forgiven. One late summer morning, the sea was calm as if it were resting after all the turmoil. Emily sat in her familiar corner by the window, an old book in her hand, a cup of warm tea beside her. She was rereading her mother's diary pages, the only thing that helped her feel the voice of a woman whose face she could not remember. The soft lines, the confidences about Charles, about the dream of a simple family by the sea. It all gradually became reality in the strangest way. Charles walked in, holding the local newspaper. He put it on the table, looking at his granddaughter with a half-joyful, half-regretful gaze. "There's a letter of interest," he said, "from the local magazine. They heard you were a journalism student and living here. They want you to write the opening article for the Young Perspective column." Emily smiled, putting down the diary. "So the Hargrove reputation still has some use." "No, it's for you." He paused, then continued. "You've lived, you've got a story, and that's enough to write." She nodded, feeling strangely relieved. No more pressure to represent a family. No more burdens from the past, just her. And her own words. That afternoon, Charles stood alone on the porch, holding an old photograph, him, his daughter, his son-in-law, and a tiny Emily on the beach. Everyone was smiling in the picture, smiles untarnished by hatred, rivalry, or loss. Emily walked up to him, holding 2 cups of tea. "You know," she said, "I used to think that family was such a fragile thing. One wrong step, one wrong decision, and it would fall apart." Charles was silent. "But maybe, family is also the only thing that can be rebuilt from the ashes." He nodded. "Families aren't perfect, but if there's love, there's hope." The two of them looked toward the sunset. The waves still crashed against the shore. Not violently, not ostentatiously, just a steady beat that reminded them that life, no matter what, would go on. That night, Emily opened her laptop and began typing the first lines of her upcoming article. "I grew up in a castle, but found myself in a small house by the sea. I used to think love was a promise that could never be broken, until I understood that true love is being wrong and still choosing to come back." This isn't a story about a corporation or a war. This is a story about a girl and her grandfather, 2 people who relearn how to be a family. As she typed the last line, Charles knocked on the door. "Are you asleep yet?" "Not yet. I have an idea for the title." "What is it?" He smiled, holding the silver compass she always wore. "The Way Home." And that is the story of Emily and her grandfather, a journey filled with hurt, regret, forgiveness, and ultimately love found again. We often think that strength lies in power, money, or status, but sometimes, the strongest thing is the courage to apologize and the courage to forgive. Families are not perfect, relatives are not always right, but it is the choice to stay together. After all, that makes us true family. Thank you for listening to this story. If you want to know what happens next, when the past is not completely closed, and the future begins to open up new paths, see you in episode 2. The Legacy We Never Chose, where Emily will have to face another truth. No one can choose their blood, but everyone must decide the path they take.